I'm Lloyd Holiday, and this is the Cost of a Thing podcast. Thanks for listening in today. The cost of a thing is the amount of time that you must spend working to buy the things that you want and need. And that directly determines your standard of living. And the American standard of living is what this podcast is all about. And I'm going to be discussing anything that affects that standard of living, especially those things that affect it negatively, and especially those things that have lowered our standard of living from the one that we had in America here in the 1960s, which was better than the one today. And why am I doing this? Because I don't see the government addressing these issues. I don't see the media addressing these issues. They've either forgotten them or ignored them. And these are some of the most important things that determine, of course, how we're going to live, how well we're going to live in the world today, especially for the young people. Okay, today I am continuing on with my top 10 super ripoffs that have been lowering the American standard of living over the past 50 years or so. And today I'm going to be talking about the number 8 super ripoff, and that is the Federal Reserve. Yes, the Federal Reserve has been responsible for lowering the American standard of living. And the main way that I think they do that is they are boosting asset prices. And when you boost asset prices, that means housing prices, that means stock prices. So the average guy who's working for a living has to pay more for housing, he has to pay more for rent, he has to pay more for stocks if he wants to invest. The prices is going to be higher because the Federal Reserve, when they print money and create money out of thin air, which they do, that drives the price of assets higher, and they are the main force behind asset price propping. And there is no doubt that the Federal Reserve is propping asset prices. They've actually come out and said that's what they are doing. I've heard Bernanke say it in the past. He was the chairman of the Federal Reserve a few years ago. I've heard Janet Yellen say that they are propping asset prices. They're not apologetic about it. They're out there and they're telling us that's what they're going to do, and that's what they are doing. So my question right here is, what's wrong with real asset prices based on real people's wages? Well, I'll answer the question myself, because I think that the reason why real asset prices are not good enough for the Federal Reserve is that they're not high enough. And if the prices go down to reflect what the wages are, the real economy, the real money that's in the economy gotten from work, that asset prices are going to go way down, and then the people who own the Federal Reserve, the bankers and Wall Street, are going to lose a lot of money because their asset values are going to go down. That's why they don't like real asset prices based on real people's wages and based on the strength of the real economy. So instead of letting the free market determine the price of assets, houses, stocks, and so forth, the free market and real people's wages determine that, how much they'll pay for a house or stocks. No, they said, no, that's not what we want to determine that price. We don't want the free market determining that price. That price will be too low if we let the free market and actual people's wages determine that price. So they've stepped in and printed a lot of money and pumped it around the system and driven those stock prices and other asset prices very high. including housing, which really hurts the American standard of living the most. High housing prices are, I think, the most damaging thing to the American standard of living. And that's widespread. Of course, you can listen to my super ripoff #1, which is housing, the video I did a few months ago. It's out there, and you can listen to why that is. And of course, the Federal Reserve is a big part of that. The Federal Reserve wants to cause higher asset prices. I've heard Greenspan, the Federal Reserve chairman back in the 80s and 90s, say this many times. He calls it the wealth effect. If there's more money given to asset holders this way, then they go out and spend money, and he thinks that drives the economy forward. But it causes a lot of inflation, and that's why our standard of living has decreased. Now, sure, it benefits those asset holders. They love that. The bankers, they hold a lot of assets. They love the prices of them to rise. And investors, certain investors own a lot of real estate and stocks, and they love those prices to rise. But the rest of us, where does that money come from? It comes from the working people. The rest of the people pay that price, and it lowers the standard of living of the regular guy. And it raises the standard of living of the investor class and the bankers and so forth. So it's a scheme. The Federal Reserve is sort of a scheme to make money flow from the working class to the investor class. And that's what it is. It's this money is flowing to them for doing nothing, just simply for owning these properties or these real estate holdings or stock holdings or any other assets. So simply by owning them, that's all you got to do, and then wait for the Federal Reserve to pump that price up, and that money just flows right in there. And it's flowing from the working person, because generally they don't hold a lot of assets, and maybe they're paying rent. Well, the rent prices are going to go up, the housing prices are going to go up, and they're going to have to pay those things, especially the young people coming in. And my purpose today here is not going to be to get into all of the workings of the Federal Reserve or the history of the Federal Reserve. I mean, I know it was created in 1913. Most people know that. And it was created by the Congress, by the government. And so they created it. And so they are responsible. The Congress is ultimately responsible for the actions of the Federal Reserve. And even if by doing nothing, they are condoning these actions, these asset price propping actions. Congress condones the Federal Reserve's actions by not acting to restrain it or to end it. They could end the Federal Reserve if they wanted to. So another way to look at it is that this asset inflation money, this free money that the equity freeloaders get, when they go spend that in the economy, that dilutes the value of real work, of our work. It dilutes the value of our paycheck. And that is how they are ripping us off with the Fed. So in other words, the value of our work is being diluted by the Federal Reserve through these asset propping schemes. And so what that means is we have to work more to get less stuff than we used to get. And that is really the definition of a lowered standard of living. We're going to work harder and longer and more hours to buy that same house that could have been bought 20 years ago for a lot less hours worked. And the same goes for all the other items throughout the economy. We're working more, getting less. That's what happens when the value of our work is diluted through these Federal Reserve schemes, asset propping schemes. So the people that get hurt the worst by this are the young people just coming out of high school or out of college and trying to start a life, start a household for themselves. So they're facing these extreme housing price bubbles in many of these big cities, especially on the West Coast and in the Northeast there, and other places. And rents are extremely high in these areas, as anyone who's in those areas knows. And if you're coming out of high school, how are you going to get a job that can afford to pay even a small, shoddy one-bedroom apartment, much less buy a home in these areas for many hundreds of thousands of dollars to start a family? That's what you need to start a family, is a home. So many young people come out into the world nowadays, and they run smack into this bubble house price wall, this rent wall of extreme housing prices, and they simply can't afford it. I mean, even renting a one-bedroom apartment, or much less trying to buy a small home to start a family or their own household, is impossible for many people, for most young people, I think. So they wind up in living maybe with their parents for longer and longer, sometimes up into their 30s, in the basement or in their old bedrooms when they were a kid. Or they wind up in multiple roommate situations where you got several people living in a small apartment, and many other situations that just are not a good standard of living. None of those are good standard of living. And I like to say this, and I've said it many times, is that the only thing standing between a young family and a fair and historical house price is the Federal Reserve. That's who's stopping you from getting a fair price, good house price to income ratio that your parents and grandparents enjoyed when they were coming up and when they raised their families. So that's why this is so insidious, and that's why it's so repugnant for me. And I say the Federal Reserve has turned into a scam with what they're doing today by propping asset prices. I don't think this was originally what they were supposed to be doing, but they're doing it now. And in my opinion, nobody owes anybody a high asset price. That should be set by the market, by what people earn and what they can afford to pay for that asset. That's where the price of assets should be. Price discovery, real price discovery, not a few bureaucrats sitting around deciding how much something should cost, an asset, a house should cost, or a condominium, or a stock. All these stocks today are propped up probably 4 or 5 times their real value by this scheme. And many times houses are propped up at least that high, that many times their real value by this same scheme. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up, and that is the number 8 super ripoff in my top 10 super ripoffs that are lowering the American standard of living, and have done so over the last 50 years or so. And so the Federal Reserve is the number 8 super ripoff. Thank you for listening in today. And until next time, this is Lloyd Holiday signing off.